I don't know whose idea it was to go to Massachusetts. Anyone who's read Terry Pratchett's Long Earth series knows that's a recipe for disaster. Joe and I had decided to spend the summer exploring America, and our travels had taken us as far as New England. Honestly, you spend all that money just to get away from England, and you end up in the discount version. Anyhow, we fetched up at the tourist office in Newburyport, nowhere near as fun as it sounds, and were arguing about where to go next. Joe was adamant that we couldn't leave New England without visiting Arkham at least once. Of course, the only reason he wanted to see it was because it shares its name with that asylum in Gotham City. I wasn't prepared to pay the amount of money it would take to get there until the very helpful man at the tourist office suggested we go by bus. Coming from Britain, I naturally assumed that bus services everywhere are terrible, but it seemed this one would take us to Arkham relatively cheaply, and although it only made one trip there and back, we were fortunate enough to have arrived an hour before the next bus. There was only one stop for an hour or so in a small town called Innsmouth. Well, Joe was determined to get to Arkham, and I had no better ideas. Besides, the bus sounded inexpensive, so we waited in the nearby station. What arrived was not so much a bus as a large van, an elderly, dirty brown vehicle. It seemed we were to be the only passengers on that rainy day in August. The driver was a squat man of indeterminate age with large eyes and greasy grey skin. I guess these Innsmouth types must be as starved of sunlight as your average Brit. We climbed aboard and paid the fare and sat at the back waiting for the bus to go. I suppose the lack of passengers should have struck me then as suspicious, but I didn't know the travelling habits of the locals. Perhaps they all had cars. Anyway, the vehicle was almost empty as we set off. Having left the city behind, we turned off onto a narrow, winding road that took us past rolling fields. One thing I'll say for America: they have space. I swear we didn't pass a single settlement or living soul after departing the city. And once we arrived at Innsmouth, well, it's a coastal town, so before we ever got there we came in sight of the sea. Then the town itself lay as a small dark cluster next to the Atlantic. If we thought the bus was quiet, that was nothing compared to the town. Not a soul did we see as we drove through dingy, narrow streets. Even the sunlight was faint, as if filtered through a curtain. The bus dropped us off outside the town hall, which was nowhere near as grand as you might expect. Like the rest of the local architecture, it was dull and grey and uninspiring. I was relieved we wouldn't have to spend more than an hour in this place. There seemed to be little or no local attractions, so Joe and I wandered the streets. I have never known a place so quiet. No people, no voices, no traffic. Even the gulls in the little bay were silent. Desperate for something to break the monotony, we decided to locate the nearest pub, or bar as they call it in the States. This we eventually found, a distinctly unfriendly-looking place called the Crown of Dagon. Don't ask me who Dagon is, because I have absolutely no idea. Joe and I are over 21 and didn't have to worry about partition laws, otherwise I expect we would have avoided America as a tourist destination. We entered the pub and for the first time discovered it was inhabited. The people, men and women, all looked the same as the driver. Big necks, short fat bodies, and queerly shaped bug eyes. They more or less ignored us, but that didn't help the feeling as we approached the bar that we were being observed. We ordered 2 beers and sat in the corner, feeling uncomfortable for reasons I can't describe. This did not feel like a country where they spoke English. The punters were muttering among themselves in a dialect I did not recognize, low and guttural. Joe had his phone out. No Wi-Fi. This was just getting better by the minute. We finished our drinks and made our way back to the town hall, glad to be leaving. But when we got there, we saw the driver and several other men clustered around the bus. "Bad news, guys," said the driver. "It's broken down. Won't be able to get the parts until tomorrow." Well, that was just peachy. Now we were going to have to spend the night in Innsmouth. The driver directed us to the town's one hotel, which looked about as cosy as the rest of the god-forsaken place. To save money, we booked a room with 2 beds, and the frog-featured receptionist gave us the key. I didn't like the way he looked at us, like we were an exotic food he hadn't come across before. I guess they didn't get many foreigners staying at this hotel. Rather than stay in our dingy hotel room, we decided to explore the town further. Not that there was much to explore. We found a pier overlooking the bay, which at least offered a change from the grey architecture of the streets. There was a small islet in the bay that I had not noticed before. A cold, barren rock by the look of it. I was busy trying to get signal with my phone in the vain hope of calling a taxi to come and pick us up. At this point I didn't care how much it cost, I just wanted to be away from that town. Then Joe uttered a cry like someone had stepped on his foot. I glanced over at him, and saw him staring over at the islet in the bay. I asked him what was the matter, and he pointed with a shaking finger, and said he had seen something moving over there. Something too big to be a gull and the wrong shape to be a human. I told him to stop being an idiot, and suggested we go back to the hotel. It was getting dark, and I was not going to be caught out on those streets after sundown. We returned to the hotel, past the odd receptionist, who leered at us as we went by. In our room there was little to do, no television nor computer to amuse ourselves. We ended up playing cards as it grew steadily darker outside. I was just about to turn in when we heard a creak. We both froze. I looked and saw the door handle turning slowly. Some sixth sense had told me to lock it earlier, and now I thanked whatever guardian angel had induced me to do such a thing. But then the nasty thought occurred to me that this was a hotel, and someone would have the key to our room. There was a muttering outside, a number of throaty voices similar to those we had heard in the tavern. I looked at Joe and motioned silently towards the window. He understood me, and we went to the window as quietly as we could. We were on the first floor, a short drop to the ground. As I opened the window as wide as it would go, we heard the key turn in the lock. I clambered out the window faster than I had ever moved in my life and dropped to the ground. It was a bad landing, and I hurt my leg doing so, but I didn't have time to check for injuries. I looked up, intending to catch Joe as he came down. He was there on the windowsill, getting ready to jump. Then something, a scaled green claw that could not have belonged to any human being, seized him from behind and dragged him back into the room. I stood there motionless until I heard Joe scream. I ran then, too terrified to think of what had become of my friend, or the creature that had taken him. I fled through the deserted streets of Innsmouth. Most of the buildings were dark, not a soul at home, but I could hear in the distance above the sound of my frantic footsteps the throaty cries of my dreaded pursuers. At last I found the road leading out of Innsmouth and followed it out. However, the denizens of that town must have guessed where my flight would take me, for I could hear them, scores of them now, giving pursuit. By the road lay a cluster of dense underbrush, where in the dark it was impossible to discern anything located within. I dived into this brush and penetrated as far as I could into the undergrowth. When it grew too thick to admit me, I crouched there amongst the thorns and long grass and waited, heart trembling. At last I heard the things that controlled Innsmouth making their way along the road. Their guttural cries filled the night, but from my hiding place I could not see them. I raised my head and felt my jaw drop. The things carried torches with them, and in the flickering light I discerned their features. These were not the frog-faced men who had occupied the tavern, though I recognized some of their number in the horde. These were creatures with the same green skin as the monster that had taken Joe, and while some of them ran like men, others leaped like frogs. It was then that darkness took me, and I think my sanity only survived because of the dead faint that came over me at that moment. My journey back to civilization was less eventful. Needless to say, I encountered no more of the creatures that inhabit Innsmouth. The authorities would not believe my story, and they came to the conclusion that Joe had simply gotten lost hiking in the wild areas that surround the town. I will never know what became of my friend. I am leaving this report as a warning to any others who should have the misfortune to come across Innsmouth. After my escape I did some research into old Innsmouth. Apparently the town had been taken over by an extremist cult in the late 1800s, a situation blown open by an outsider in the 1920s. Most of the townsfolk were arrested, and the affair was hushed up by the authorities, hence their reluctance to investigate. Whatever happened nearly 100 years ago, the town is once again in the hands of those who took control back then, and while I can only guess the nature of this cult, I know that those who took Joe from me are not human. Death and sorrow await any who should trespass in the dark streets of Innsmouth.